I'm here. My name is Phil. I'm here with someone called Sherry, who's also here. And we
Good,
just
good start.
had a trip together. Is this a good start?
It's a great
We had
start.
a trip together and we're to talk about that trip. So, just to define our roles in this conversation, I serve in the board of AEE. I'm the president-elect, and Sherry is the executive director of AEE. And we went to a conference in Hong Kong that was the AEE conference there. So we're going to talk about that a little bit and our experiences and some of the things that we learned through our experience going to Hong Kong. But before we start going into some of the details, I want to give us some backstory or a background around why we might have gone and who that region is. So I'm going to hand it over to Sherry.
Thanks, Phil. So the Asia Pacific region came about approximately 4 years ago. AE has always had regions, but our regions have been North American centric. So have involved Canada and Mexico, but we haven't had a specific group other than an international region. And we had several people in the Asia Pacific region interested in starting something over there. And so many dedicated volunteers made up the Asia Pacific Council, and they have been working diligently. Their idea was that they would have a conference, and so that got started in Singapore. And we had a conference with the Singapore University of Social Sciences. And then the next year we had a conference in India, which the group of volunteers there made happen. And then we just had a conference in Hong Kong. So the Asia Pacific Region Council gets together and talks about what that region needs. And that's specifically what our regions are for, to connect people within a specific geographic area that are doing experiential education in all different ways. So this region is huge. We know it's huge. It involves Korea, Japan, Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong, China, New Zealand, Australia, India. It's Indonesia. It's massive. It's massive, and we know it's massive. And the idea is that eventually it might break into smaller groups, smaller geographical regions. But right now, as we're trying to get things started, it's going to stay this big. And it's fascinating that it's this large because it really brings in all different voices and all different areas, and we get to share what's happening in our professional world.
And you mentioned something there around like how large, and I think that is something that is a takeaway that I had from the experience in general. And so maybe we'll go into like large topic, like what our general feelings or lessons learned, and then we'll go into maybe more minutia. But for me, going to the other side of the world to participate in an experiential education conference, I don't know exactly what I was planning to expect. I expected some like tie in or like some familiarity. And I would say that there wasn't necessarily that. I put a post on LinkedIn about we connect more with the why than the what, when, and where. And I think that was my overall connection, is that everyone there shared commonality in terms of the why behind why we do the work we do.
Yeah.
But one of the big takeaways was that I didn't know a lot of people. I hadn't heard of any of the people. And I think that was a really good takeaway for me from a perspective of what is the strategic plan around how do we increase international inclusivity, is that as someone growing up in the industry in the US, I did not know a lot of the people and I hadn't heard a lot of the messages shared. So, that is, I think, a really important takeaway for me that I'm continuing to think about, is what is the information we don't know and how do we get that information, not about sharing information from the US centric perspective, but how do we gain that information from other parts of the world?
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to remember as we work on this international inclusion, is that it's not the US bringing the knowledge of experiential education that we have to other places. It's them sharing their knowledge of experiential education within that region. And then if we're involved, or if other people from outside of the region get to go, then that perspective, that different lens, right, that they're looking at it through. And again, that why we do this work is really the connector. Meeting the Treasure Island group there, and they have a surf experiential education surf camp that they've been running for 30 years or 20 years. It was a very long time. And they obviously don't need information about how experiential education works. They know how it works. They've been doing it. Yeah, getting that different lens is the important piece.
Hmm. Something else that I'd written down as like some notes for me in terms of things that I'd learned. And now I'm only speaking from the lens of like this is the first time I've gone over to Asia to do a conference, but something I noticed is the real focus on academia in terms of legitimizing the field, and it could be for the basis of grant funding, it could be for the basis of allowing more people to come into the field. But the way I kind of defined it is it felt more academic and less play based, even though there was playfulness to some of the conversations and stuff. It felt that it was less play based. I wonder if that is something that you experienced also in the India conference or not, or if this was specific to Hong Kong. But I just found that an interesting takeaway from me of like it created more legitimacy, even to an extent. And I sort of joked with you there, it was the first time I've had to wear a button-up shirt for a conference in probably any conference that I've ever attended since I've come to the States. And it felt like, wow, this is a level of seriousness, academic seriousness, that I haven't experienced. Not that I would say that we need to necessarily have that in the US, but I just found that a striking difference. I wonder if you reflected likewise.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think the setting of the conference has made a difference. The first conference in Singapore was at Singapore University of Social Sciences, and it involved a lot of students, and a lot of students presented and did workshops, and there was a lot of academics involved in that one, obviously, because it was at a university. And then the India conference, I would say, was also in a university setting, but the planning group involved was not in academia. So maybe it's more influenced by who is planning it. And then the Hong Kong conference was at an independent school. And so a K through grade 12 school. And so I think the academic focus was strong there also. So I think maybe the focus, who is hosting the conference, makes a difference.
Hmm.
And also the idea, I think culturally in the Asia Pacific region, lens of academia is important to legitimize the work. And I think maybe here in the United States, we've had that for a while. We've had that
Mm.
academia, the Journal of Experiential Education that AE has been producing, has been around for 30 years, 40 years. And so we maybe have more of that legitimacy with academia and have kind of moved past that or chosen to ignore it. I think a lot of our programs just do what they do,
Yeah.
and so maybe that hasn't been as front and center in the US.
Yeah, that makes sense. I would I would also like note that there was a good community of people I was talking to that had the same mindset that I think we've had for a while of like having experiential ed be more than just outdoor focused. And even though there were a lot of outdoor educators in the group, a lot of the topics that I found were being discussed were on a larger lens than just outdoor education focused.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe let's just go into some things that we took from workshops that we may have attended. Um, I'm going to start just by these were the buckets I tended to find that the conversations were being had in terms of the conference. There was a real large leaning towards risk management,
Mm.
and there were a lot of folks who were doing risk management workshops. There was also service learning was a topic that got brought up a lot, and also child safeguarding, which was a term that maybe folks in the US aren't as familiar with, but it was essentially child abuse prevention programming, but with just a reframing into safeguarding, a term that I believe is used very much in Europe and Asia at the moment. For me, I start by saying like the risk management workshops that I attended were really important for me, and I can share in the description of this maybe some documents that I received there. But the big takeaway for me from risk management was the desire to make sure that organizations, both adventure, outdoor, experiential, are really focusing on practice and not just having policies in place, but actually practicing those strategies. So I went to a workshop that was by Dr. Claire, and it was a really good to mock out processes by like a phone call that comes through that something has happened on your course and you're the point person, and how do you gain information if you're not the actual person who's at the site, who's seeing the incident? How do you deal with that, and how do you ascertain the right information to give to emergency services, to give to the media? And I was struck by the desire to practice those skills, because I realized, and I've since brought it back to High Five, this desire to make sure we're practicing these things, even though they don't happen very frequently, making sure that everyone on staff not just have the policies in place and written down things, but you actually mock them out and role model them. I hadn't considered those. So seems obvious, but it was like a thing that was really interesting to listen to, and then you're like taking notes and realizing all the things you're not doing well, and that's a good mindset to be in. So there were a lot of risk management lensed conversations that I think reminded me we need to do a little bit of a more intentional job of practicing. What is something that you took away from a workshop?
So I attended a workshop given by students, and I think that was one of those things that reminded me that we need to focus on our students. They're doing an amazing program through the university social outreach, where they're taking children who have had cancer into, taking them kayaking, taking them doing scavenger hunt around the city, taking them hiking. And it was a lovely program and very well run. But I think the idea that focusing on students, our next generation of AE members, and making sure they have opportunities to share what they're doing, to be involved, to be included, to feel that sense of belonging. That would take away for me was we need to make sure we are focusing on our students and helping them gain experience and gain knowledge, and just making sure they have a place in AE.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's often a takeaway from a lot of these events that we get to go to. It's how do we bring in that next generation of people? And
Mm-hmm.
so how do we accommodate those? Yeah, I remember I had some really good conversations about bringing in that next generation, of considering this the Jump Foundation, who will be hosting the next one in Bangkok. I was talking to them about the same issues that we have in the US around hiring. It's
Yeah.
very interesting. Like, it doesn't matter where you are in the world, you go over and you just say like, "Hey, how's it going with like hiring?" Like, "Oh, it's awful at the moment." Wow, how is that a cultural thing that's shifted over? You think about like salary being an issue, but I think that there's opportunities, and how do we bring in the next group of people to have those opportunities is important. And I would almost highlight for those maybe who are listening, who are hosting conferences, to allow for students to present and have like maybe a track of first time presenters, because I think that is that kind of next step for people, sometimes getting their names out. It was interesting as well, that in this conference they had many different keynotes. So there was like each day there were like one or two keynotes. That one of them was Olympic athletes from Hong Kong, that you would assume that maybe like doesn't necessarily align, but it was like the messages they were sharing about mental health and stuff for us as educators to be more aware of. I think that was very impactful also, in terms of like how do we that for me kind of broadens the scale of what we do in experiential ed. Is like, oh, when we bring in a group that you wouldn't think necessarily aligns, and it's like, oh no, these people, not only were they good speakers, and were cool. It's like, oh wow, Olympic athletes. Um, but it was interesting how their messages kind of aligned with the work that we get to do.
Yeah. Phil, I want to jump back to the student
Mm.
piece, because in March we'll be opening up the call for proposals for workshops for the AE International Conference, which happens in November of this year. And we will have a first time presenter track. So we're hoping for students and for folks maybe new to the industry or who have just never presented before because they haven't felt there was a place for them. We will be having a 60-minute session that's just going to be first time presenters. And we're hoping to get some new voices in. So look out for that.
That's awesome. And yeah, I get lots of people messaging about like start how to present, and I've done podcast episodes on it. So I would say that's a perfect opportunity. I would say a safe space to practice, because we're all very friendly people. And it's in Pittsburgh. So just in terms of location and region for transportation for folks, it will be in
Yep.
Pittsburgh.
Pittsburgh, yeah. But Back to the Olympic athletes, I agree that it was great to have kind of that outside of our industry voice come in and shine some light on the mental health and that drive that those athletes have, that amazing determination, and could how that could correlate and connect with our work. Having an outside voice is always a great thing to have at a conference, because we can become siloed in our experiential education and academic school worlds. And so, yeah, that was a great benefit, I thought, a really interesting piece.
Another thing I was kind of intrigued by, and I think that they all, in fact, I would say all of the keynotes in terms of risk management, there was on community sharing in terms of creating a hub for outdoor educators to connect virtually. There was child safeguarding, which I think for most people was quite a jarring topic. And when it was done in the keynote, you're gonna have to remind me the name. What was it? Tim
Garish.
Tim Garish, who used to work in Scotland Yard as a detective, came in to talk about really kind of like social media and the awareness that we need to have around posting images of children. The thing that was very striking to me was that the video that he shared had a young girl who was 9 called Ella. So that's my daughter, an exact age. So that was like, wow, that hits hard.
Talking to you, yeah.
Yeah, talking directly at me. But one thing I do want to note on him, which was very experiential, probably actually one of the highlights for me from the way that people can craft questions. He probably wouldn't define himself as an experiential educator. That would be my guess.
Mm-hmm.
But what he did was he had on the board, he had us find partners, and we had to share with our partner we had to pick one of 5 topics to discuss with our partner. He was very explicit in saying that he was going to interrogate us afterwards about this. So that added the lens of like, oh God, a detective is going to interrogate us on our answers. But one of the topics was to talk in detail about our first sexual experience. So there was like all of these different ones. There was like,
Yeah, they started out easy.
started out easy, like something you're like habit you have that you'd be embarrassed to talk about. There were like other things, but they were very easy. And then there was that last one. And so there was all this like tension around it. And then
Yeah, you could feel
Russ
it in
would,
the room. People were,
yeah,
you could
just
feel the stress level go up.
and it was awkward. And I was sitting next to a guy, Rod Field from Australia, and we really actually never answered the question because we ummed and ahed which one we were going to answer for ages. And then he timed us out, and I was like, oh God, I hope he doesn't ask us because we'll have to
We'll have to say
embarrassingly
we
say
didn't
we
pick. Yeah.
didn't answer any of them because we were so embarrassed. But then he never really got to the interrogation part. He sort of did it lightly, but what he really tied it to is he wanted us to experience what it was like to have that feeling of having to answer those questions. He tied it back to the visceral experience that we had, and then tied that into an experience of a child experiencing some level of abuse or not wanting to talk about it with others
Mm-hmm.
because of the fear of embarrassment or the fear of the repercussion of talking about it. And just the fact that he was able to tie an emotional response to us in those questions to an experience that a child might have, it was for me. It was like, wow, what a masterclass in experiential ed. Because,
Yeah.
and I think it's interesting because I'd love to have talked to him after. I never connected to him. Maybe I'll try to reach out to him. But I wonder if he must know that that's the intent. But
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if he understands from experiential learning methodology or pedagogy, if he knows that what he did there for the group, more so than the topic. I've heard more people talk about like, wow, that was so clever.
Yeah, getting us to feel that feeling, right?
Yeah.
Without putting us in that horrible situation. But yeah, having that sense of anxiety and panic and being unable to talk about something and knowing you're going to have to tell somebody else about it. That was genius.
I
Really
was
was.
definitely thinking like, how can I tie it into risk management discussions or rescue training? I'm going to do
Oh
some
yeah.
pondering on this idea of this, like the feeling. How do you generate a feeling? Because there's always a thing in whenever you're doing like any rescue training or like first
Drill.
aid or
Yeah.
wilderness first aid, I know that it's like hard to create the reality of an exact experience. And
Right.
when you mock it out in a fake environment, it never has that stress level. And that's always like, this would be stressful, but I know this
Right.
isn't now. Like that experience was very much an emotional experience and it was very well done.
Yeah.
No doubt Tim listens to this podcast, so
He'll
he
know.
will
He'll know how great we
he'll
speak.
know without me reaching out. Thank you, Tim. That was really well done. Let's talk now, like talking about like experiences, and like we've talked about some of the takeaways. And one thing I would ask is from listeners is feel free to reach out to both me and Sherry to ask like more specific details about like either how you might get involved if you're listening and how you might create your own regions. Like this is something that leading back to that strategic planning goal, something we're really intentional about. And I know that I've had a listener, Maria, you're probably listening, and thank you for reaching out from Colombia. And in terms of like creating a region in Latin America, like that's something that we're really like
Yeah.
pursuing and looking at.
Yeah.
So
And it's
know
happening.
that,
It's happening.
and it's happening.
Maria's she's now connected with 4 other people who are interested in helping. So if anybody wants to support a Latin American region, we would love to have you involved. Reach out to Phil or I, and we will get you connected with other people in that area. We'd love to have a conference there.
Yeah, absolutely. And so like know that when sometimes I think you think about things and people think like I would never be able to do that, or the reality is like both myself and Sherry are volunteers first before we got into this industry, or at least volunteers when we started in this industry, and it allowed us to make those connections. And so feel free to reach out, please do. And I will put our contact details in the description as usual. So last thing, or maybe like we can talk about is like the lighter world, because we are experiential educators and it doesn't want to feel too like, oh, it was just an experience of learning, which is all positive. But you and I got to have some experiences. So I think that it might be worthy of sharing those, allowing us to reflect upon those. And the 2 that I had, and you might have others, this is just my 2 that stood out to me, was one standing in a giant line of people and the conclusion to that. And then the second was the post, like just being immersed in the stuff that tourists maybe don't get to experience with a good friend, Trevor.
Yeah.
So I'll start with the first one. It's actually those 2 things, experiences feel very polar opposite almost, because
Yeah.
early on in the experience, we were 2 tourists navigating the world of Hong Kong and getting on trains and buses and being like figuring things out and using our phones and realizing like without phones, we would have got lost. And the joy of an octopus card, which is a very Hong Kong thing, which is like the Oyster in
Beep.
London, which you just scan your phone on everything and it gives you stuff and it's very gamified. You think like, wow. Then you realize you're actually using your own money, but you forget that. But we decided to go on a cable car, a gondola ride up to see the Big Buddha. And we joined the standard line and go around a corner and it was just a giant line. Like a crazy amount of people, and it didn't have like the Disney thing where it shows how long, so we were like anticipating how long, and then we saw 2 people in front of us decide to give up. It actually reminds me of there's this concept of the second leader. Like if the first leader isn't the most influential person in the room, it's like the person that follows the first person, because then it creates like this idea of like, oh, it feels okay to do it. So 2 people ahead of us gave up and then just went, we're going to upgrade to this thing called the Crystal Line, which allowed you to have like a glass floor in the cable car. And so we
Well,
and
it was your quick math too that helped us.
yeah, of trying to figure out how much more expensive it would be, and it ended up being like not that more expensive for us when you translated or did the exchange rate. But in doing so, we were able to skip the line. So this is like if you're going to Hong Kong and you go to I think it was like Crystal 360, is that what it was called? Like this cable car. Feel that you can go up to the Crystal and not be too cost effective, but like if you're there for a limited time, there's no point staying in line. But for us, we sort of cheated the system because we did that and then it got bumped all the way to the front of the line, and we ended up getting randomly like a private cable car, which I think would have been like another 2,000 Hong Kong dollars if if we'd actually spent the money.
Right, to get the private one, but
it's that feeling of like you found the cheat code in a game, and then it was like we spent the entire time just giddy
because we leveled up.
It felt like we had leveled up,
totally
and then
leveled up.
And then you just saw like other cable cars. Like, how did they do that? I don't know. It just felt like we cheated the system.
Yeah.
So that highlights for me. What about maybe at the front end of the experience to you was a highlight?
Well, Phil, you and I have never traveled together. So the experience that sticks out to me was us waiting at the airport. So groggy, we'd both been on flights for hours and hours and hours. And we thought the hotel had a shuttle from the airport. And we thought we were in the right place. And we stood there together, and I remember thinking, it's going to be okay to travel with Phil. He's okay with uncertainty. He's okay with just figuring out what's happening. He's okay with, figuring it all out. And so um, we did eventually figure out that we did not have a shuttle from the hotel because we called the hotel, and then we figured out the train system and that sense of accomplishment that after being sleep deprived, having it all, and then also that sense of appreciation when we got to the hotel and we were there early, and they said we could check in early, and that like, oh, we're gonna get to have a little rest, a little shower, a little a little downtime. But really, that idea of you and I, we know each other a little bit, but you don't always travel well with everyone.
Hmm.
People are different, and people have different concepts and different ideas, but that like appreciation of, oh, it's gonna be good, this is gonna work out because we can both roll with whatever is gonna happen.
Hmm.
That was good for me.
Yeah, I reflect. I think I think you'd said at a point, maybe towards the end of the trip, that there should always be the opportunity to travel with someone that you're going to end up working with closely, because it kind of accelerates the experience of a bonding.
Yeah.
It certainly is like, wow, yeah, like I know Sherry way more than I did before, and it's like, but it also just from a perspective of like how we interact or travel together, and for the most part, we were like just dragged around together. It was, I mean, now, so it leads into the end part, like the
Right.
end of the experience. We'd just gone to a regional meeting, and then one of the members, Trevor, who used to serve on the board, then said like, "Oh, yeah, we're going to come with us, so I'll meet you at the hotel." And we didn't exactly know what we were doing. We thought we were going to dinner, but we were taken to a private calligraphy class, and it was, I think, one of the most relaxing experiences that I've had on a trip, in terms of like, we had it, there was something that we'd read somewhere that was making us laugh for a while about this 50 experience, like your experience,
Mm.
and you're like, I don't know if I would like want to taste an experience, but this had, I think, would define as 5-dimensional experience. It had, we were doing the calligraphy, so there's the touch part. We obviously could see, we were looking at stuff, but we had to pick out a scent for incense.
Mm-hmm.
There was
Mm-hmm.
that exchange of like picking a smell that we wanted in the room, and then we also got to drink tea.
Mm-hmm.
So there was that piece, and then there was music as well, on, and but we were also being crafted in having to do calligraphy with a master calligraphy instructor whose Western name was Wingman, which made
Yep.
us giggle.
Yep.
But he didn't speak English, and so there was the translation component to it, and
And
I
there
don't
was
know
a
that.
touch. There was a touch too. He took our hand to
Yes,
guide the brush for the Chinese
yeah,
calligraphy, like to get
yeah,
us to hold the brush correctly. Yeah. And
and
then we
I
got
like
we got chocolates when we did good.
chocolates when we did
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
I do
Yeah.
remember that. And then we kicked out a group of kids to go there. I like that we arrived and like kids were being shuttled out, and it felt like, oh, did we just cancel their class now? But yeah, it was, that was, I don't know. And then after that, we ate snake soup. So
Yeah, I
like,
was gonna
this is
say,
like,
and then we ate snake. So with Wingman and Trevor.
yeah, with Wingman and Trevor, and we explained to Wingman what Wingman meant in English. So yeah, there was a good. I would say like that was a good, those kind of bookmark experiences. I always like to consider an experience. At least that was my bookmark. I know that you had a couple extra days of experience also, but I think like for like our experience, that was a really great way for to conclude for me, because it was like, wow, what a difference in a week from a very tourist experience to a very authentic experience after
Mm-hmm.
having an experiential ed conference about stretch and risk, and and all those things, and then to do that ourselves and just put ourselves at the mercy of the wonderful Trevor, in terms
Mm-hmm.
of like, he's going to take us somewhere, and we were just wandering some back streets, and it was like very surreal.
Yeah.
It's just, I think that that's a wonderful experience. I want to highlight that, yes, the two of us got to have a cool experience, and it feels like, oh wow, we're just hearing two people have a experience. But once again, I tie it into the piece of this is an intentional trip for the two of us, and the immersive of all those experiences and connections, I always tie into being the most valuable thing of all the people that I got to meet, the continued connection with Sherry, and then just knowing as members of AEE, if you are a member, and I encourage you to be members, know that that's intentional for us to be more front facing, or at least the board to be more front facing, so that you know who we are and can connect with us. So that would be my like kind of conclusory, that's not a word, conclusion to the experience is to stay kind of connected, because we are experiential educators. Having experiences is awesome, and then how do we connect those to that learning is really important too.
Yeah. Well, Phil, I think one of the things that we do in experiential education is create relationships, and I think that is core to this goal, the strategic goal of intentional international inclusion and belonging. And I've had people say, oh my gosh, it's so amazing you get to travel so much, which it is. And I'm very grateful and thankful for that. But I think the key is me going these places is creating these relationships, is creating these amazing connections. I've been able to connect people across the globe now and help that network, and just, those real live experiences with each other, going through a conference, sitting in a workshop with somebody else and doing a funny activity. In India, we did Play for Peace had a workshop, and we played games, and doing that with somebody, and then you have that connection, right? And you can call on them and say, hey, remember me, and now this person is interested in doing this. Are you interested in doing this? But those connections are the key to building our network and our membership, and making sure people feel included and belong to this organization. And so, yeah, that's my overall takeaway is we live in a world where you can WhatsApp, you can text, you can email, you can, all the things, but really having a moment where you can laugh with somebody or that room where we sat in with Tim when he made us all feel the same thing, like those experiences connect us, and there's no way to replicate those other than being there.
Yep, absolutely. We all share the same goal, and it was very amazing to be on the other side of the world, and just interact with people who had the same thoughts, feelings, concerns, all of those things. So it was a very like, oh yeah, we're all human kind of definite moment for me. And know for future episodes of Vertical Playpen, and probably future episodes of the AEE podcast, there will be more voices from other parts of the world as we start sharing their stuff. And if you know of people that you would like to feature on either of our podcasts and talk about the work they're doing, then I would encourage you to reach out, because these are two other platforms, ways that we can continue those connections. So for where the future brings us. And once again, if you have any questions or ideas or thoughts on how to support that strategic planning goal for AEE, then please reach out to us, and we would love to listen to you and talk to you.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks all. All right. Bye.